Greetings and welcome back to PBH 275, Injury Prevention and Control. One of this week's two topics is going to be occupational injuries. We're going to talk about occupational injuries a little bit differently than we talked about some of the other injury topics earlier in the semester for a couple of reasons. One of them being that this is what I do for a living, occupational injury and illness prevention, and it's something that I'm very passionate about and know a lot about, and so we're going to go a little bit deeper into the history of occupational injury and illness knowledge, of incidents that have occurred, and some of the controls that are used to prevent occupational injuries and illnesses. I'm specifically adding illnesses as well because many of what we think of as occupational illnesses, when you look at the pathology of them, they might match a little bit more closely with injuries because a lot of times there will be one acute injurious exposure to something like, say, asbestos fibers that happens relatively early in a person's working career, and then it is latent for many years, and the diseases that emerge from that, they don't require chronic exposure. Sometimes just an acute exposure will happen, and then the illness will not manifest itself until many years after that single acute exposure. So therefore, it's almost like a long-lasting exposure to an injurious event than a traditional illness. There will also be some data presented on types of fatal and non-fatal workplace injuries that occur in the U.S. I'm not going to talk so much about cost of injuries. That's something that it gets a little bit repetitious if we cover that with every single injury topic. We are going to talk about some of the hidden costs of occupational injuries, particularly with regards to the increased risk of depression, suicide, and drug overdose. And then I'm going to talk about future challenges in occupational health and safety. Again, this is going to be a little bit different than some of the other lectures we've had or will have later in the semester. But let's get started. I told you that we were going to cover some history in this occupational injuries lecture. We're going to cover a lot of history, and we're going to go very far back to the earliest humans, the prehistoric times when there's no written record of things that were done back then. We just have to rely on fossil record. We know that the earliest humans did not really have what we now would consider to be occupations. With that being said, though, some of the earliest humans did tend to cluster in family groups, other clan groups, and things like that. And they did assign different tasks for the survival of the group. They were assigned and conducted by particular people based on skill level and what they were good at. Agriculture as a profession or as a thing that people do for basic survival, for sustenance, has existed for at least 11,000 years based on fossil records. Back during the Stone Age, using crude stone and bone tools, there was actually the attempts to grow food. We have evidence of mining or quarrying in this case for flint, which was used to make fire and weapons, and the record of that dates back about 10,000 years. Again, we're not relying on written records for this because they didn't exist. We're relying on sort of fossil and debris records. We don't really know the degree to which people were harmed by their occupations, if they were quarrying, if they were farming, or whatever other things were happening in prehistory, because there was no written record. As mankind transitioned into what's now called the Bronze Age, which went from roughly 3300 to 700 before Common Era, occupations started to become a little bit more of a thing, partly because of bronze. The ability to smelt metals with lower melting points and create tools, art, and other useful things was one of the hallmarks of the Bronze Age. As these abilities were developed, we also developed more urban societies where not everybody was responsible for just hunting and gathering or farming anymore. Some people could be designated to do those jobs, whereas other people could do things involving some of the new tools that were being invented that kind of would help the greater collective society. Different types of mining started to emerge. It wasn't just quarrying for flint anymore. Now people were actually going underground looking for low melting point metal ores. And eventually, as technologies improved, they started to use iron ore as well, which required higher melting points and more intense fires. Smelting became a profession too, where you could actually convert these metal ores into useful metals. Craftsmen and artisans started to emerge, people who could work with metal and glass and pottery to make useful tools or just things that could, that you could use to decorate your domicile. And as city-states emerged, defense became an important provision as well. So therefore, people began to be hired to be soldiers and watchmen and guards for these emerging city-states. The first actual written record we have of occupational injuries goes back to about the year 1700 BCE, and it's called the Edwin Smith Papyrus. And based on where the papyrus was found and what it describes, it appears to be describing orthopedic injuries that came from the construction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt. So it was good to have this papyrus and a few other papyruses from the Bronze Age period to describe some of these things, but the day-to-day lives of workers in the Bronze Age still mostly went undocumented. We can only speculate with the difficult life that people who worked as potters and metallurgists must have had, based on the fact that we know in modern times that what chronic exposures to mercury, lead, and arsenic can do in terms of acute toxicity, in terms of neurological conditions that eventually shorten life and cause behavioral issues, it's very likely that the potters and metallurgists of this era also suffer from some of these neurological conditions. But again, because the lives of sort of the common people were not documented very well during that era, we can only speculate. What is clearly known, based on fossil and other burial records, is that a lot of the hazardous tasks that were performed in some of these prehistoric and early written historic cultures were performed by slaves, many of whom apparently suffered very greatly and lived short lives. We know that the people who mined, they worked in unventilated spaces, they suffered from severe pulmonary diseases. Based on fossil records, it appeared that most of them died relatively young. A lot of the workers who worked on the Egyptian pyramids had extensive broken and poorly set bones, again, based on examination of bones from that era. There was an unfortunate line of thinking back then that extended forward for many centuries, which was that hazardous tasks, if people did them and people got sick and injured and died, it was because of moral defect or poor moral fiber or things like that. People weren't really putting the connection together that there were conditions that these people were being subjected to that were shortening their lives. And unfortunately, this would persist for many centuries. So the history that we're talking about in this lecture, it's largely going to be what we would now consider to be Western history, meaning a history that happened in Europe and the Middle East, and then eventually into North America and the United States. That doesn't mean that other histories of this time were not important. It's just that these are the histories for which we have the best written records, and from where many of the work practices and other things that we eventually adopted in the United States came from the places that colonized the United States. Next thing we're going to talk about is moving forward in time into the Greek and then subsequently Roman era. The Greek culture was very good about documentation, about documenting the conditions, the society they built, why they built it, the kind of things that mattered to them. So we know a lot about the attitude toward work and health and things like that in Greek culture, which started around roughly 800 BCE. We know that early Greek societies saw that work had a negative health effect on people. The people that tended to work didn't live very long. They lived painful lives. And so people that could afford to in Greek societies tried to avoid work at all cost. This meant that most of the tasks that were required for the city-states were done by slaves, or people that were captured in different wars and things like that. There were people who actually were free, who were not enslaved, and worked in manual labor tasks in Greek society, but they were largely stigmatized. They were kind of looked down upon due to the fact that they had to work for a living. If you want to have an idea of what Greek societies thought of work and people that had to perform work, there's this quote that's attributed to Socrates. It's in Xenophon's Economicus. And I'll apologize in advance for the fact that, again, this is a different era, and so the gendered language used in here is not something that we would use these days. But here's the quote attributed to Socrates. "Those arts that are called mechanical are spoken against everywhere and have quite plausibly come by a very bad reputation in the cities. For they utterly ruin the bodies of those who work at them, and when the bodies are made effeminate, the souls, too, become much more diseased. Lack of leisure to join in the concerns of friends and of the city is another condition of those that are called mechanical." During the Greek era, and certainly as it transitioned into the Roman era, there were some pretty good advances made in medicine and also in knowledge about occupational injuries, about what causes them and how to prevent them. The problem is that not much of this knowledge was actually applied preventively to protect workers. During this era, workers were still considered to be largely disposable because they were slaves, or they were prisoners, or they were people who were free but were not members of the elite of society, and that's why they had to work for a living. So there was not really any value put on protecting people from workplace injuries. One kind of lone voice in the wilderness during the Roman Empire era was Pliny the Elder. He was a man who lived from roughly the years 23 to 79 of the Common Era. He noted that people who mined silver, that yes, they died prematurely. They suffered a lot. But he actually noted that there were hazards that these silver miners faced that was actually causing them to live shortened lives. And he actually came up with an idea for very early personal protective equipment. He recommended that silver miners wear animal bladders over their faces as a very crude form of respiratory protection. The miners that did this actually did wind up living a little bit longer. I mean, it still wasn't ideal. It was still a very dangerous place to work. Most of them still suffered and died sooner than their peers who weren't sent down in the silver mines, but still, this was an important little milestone in our occupational safety and health knowledge. We learned a lot, too, from the writings of Galen, who lived from roughly 129 to 200. He was an orthopedic surgeon and a physician for the gladiators in the court of Marcus Aurelius. Needless to say, there was a lot of orthopedic injuries that were suffered by the gladiators who actually survived their contests, and he documented some of the conditions and some of the recommended practices to wouldn't necessarily prevent the injuries, but would like to heal the injuries so that the gladiators could go back to work, as it were. Eventually, the Roman Empire fell, and in what we now call the Western world, the next era was a pretty rough time. Up to this point, conditions for workers had still not advanced very far. I mean, there had been some very minor steps taken during the Greco-Roman era, but for the most part, again, workers were not protected because they were not valued. In the Western world, after the fall of the Roman Empire, it somehow got even worse after that. This era is often known as the Dark Ages now, because a lot of forms of health took a step back in these centuries following the fall of the Roman Empire. Not just medicine, but public health and occupational health all took a step back for a few various reasons. One was that there was a sort of a new way of thinking where the body and the spirit were two separate things, and the most important thing was making sure that your spirit was right and that your body was relatively unimportant. There was an interesting mix of both Christian and pagan ideals in the culture that emerged in the West after the fall of the Roman Empire. And besides the separation of body and spirit, one of the other big ideas that came from this era was that if you suffered a disease or an injury, it was a punishment for sins, and that your treatment should be to seek prayer and also penitence. That any medicine that's going to be given to a person should be guided by church doctrine, and in fact, if it's not guided by church doctrine, then any sort of medicine or other preventive actions could be construed as interfering with God's will. So, yeah, it was a bad time for medicine, a bad time for public health, a really bad time for occupational health. But again, we're talking about the West. It was undoubtedly a very difficult time in Europe for medicine and public health and occupational health from roughly the years 500 to about 1000 or 1100 CE. But in other parts of the world, it really wasn't a dark ages at all. In the Middle East, there was still a continued flourishing of health and of public health and even occupational health. Part of that was because many of these Islamic cultures had actually closely studied some of the Greek and Roman teachings in health and had brought them back to their regions. And then after the Roman Empire fell, there wasn't a new wave of Christian and pagan mixing that had separated body and spirit. Instead, they just continued on with and built on some of the Greek and Roman teachings in health and kept advancing their societies. One good example of this would be Raziz, who lived from roughly the years 850 to 923. He was a Persian physician and actually a pediatrician. He was one of the first people that actually studied and realized that the physiologic needs of kids were different than adults and that the medicine for kids needed to be different than the medicine for adults. One of the things that Raziz did that had never been done before that we knew of, and it was really critical, was that when he wrote down his cases, he would include a statement of occupation so that later on people could trace that people in certain occupations tended to suffer certain injuries and certain diseases at greater concentrations than other people. Raziz was also kind of special in his time because he advocated for the ethical treatment of workers. He saw that workers were important to a functioning society and that workers should not be considered disposable. Again, this was kind of a revolutionary thought at the time. And while we don't have time to cover every single culture and how they handled occupational health and safety during the early times, I will briefly mention the Far East and that traditional Chinese medicine has been used for thousands of years, is still used to this day for treating various types of injuries, either on-the-job injuries or outside of the job injuries. And some of these techniques, they still appear to work very well, even in modern times. Things like acupuncture and Tai Chi, the form of massage known as Tui Na, and also certain types of herbs. So just because this was a bad time for occupational health and safety and public health in the Western world, there were still advances taking place in other parts of the world. The Western world started to slowly reemerge back into the realms of public health around the year 1300. This is kind of when the Renaissance era began in what we now call the West. During this era, there was a new recognition of occupational injuries and diseases, that they were what caused them and how to prevent them. Part of this was because international commerce started to open up, and so people became exposed, or in some cases re-exposed, to the ideas of what skilled tradesmen can do. That it's actually very valuable to have somebody that can build windows, that can forge tools, that can mine and smelt and do things like that. There was still plenty of social stratification, though, even in the Renaissance era. One of the more interesting characters from the Renaissance era was Georgius Bauer, also known as Agricola. Agricola kind of bucked a lot of the conventional wisdom at the time. He believed that mines were an inherently dangerous place to work. He advocated for improvements in ventilation of mines. He advocated for early personal protective equipment, such as leather boots and gloves, to be worn by people who worked in mines, and also advocated for veils to be worn over the face to protect against dust inhalation. Again, we're talking about, several centuries after Pliny the Elder had suggested that Roman miners wear animal bladders over their faces if they were going to be underground in silver mines. Agricola wrote extensively about occupational health and safety. He described several preventive measures not just against mining injuries, but against injuries to joints, ways to protect yourself from orthopedic and ergonomic injuries. He described how to prevent hazards such as falling off of ladders and how to shore up mines so the shafts don't cave in. Turns out that Agricola also had some pretty, at the times, controversial opinions about mining. In his work De Re Metallica, he actually said of mining that there is no compensation which should be thought great enough to equalize the extreme dangers to safety and life. He was actually, in a sense, advocating for a society where nobody would go down into the mines because it was so inherently unsafe. This is something we still struggle with in the modern day. There are some tasks that we've decided that are important to do for our society, but yet that put people at great risk of injury and death. We'll talk about this sort of existential problem a little bit more later in this lecture. During the Renaissance era, first emerged the recognition of a dose-response relationship in occupational health. In other words, the idea that the greater your exposure to a hazard, the greater your likelihood of being injured or killed by that hazard. For those of you who have taken toxicology, you will know that generally we ascribe this dose-response relationship as first being recognized by Paracelsus, who said, again translated from Latin, the dose makes the poison. Now, the mechanisms of occupational disease states were still not very well known until the advent of microscopy in the 1600s. But just recognizing a dose-response relationship and recognizing the inherent value of work, there emerged a slow recognition that both injuries and illnesses of workers were not due to some kind of moral defect in the workers, but they were due to hazardous conditions under which people were being made to work. It seems so fundamental now, but this was kind of revolutionary at the time. One of the most important figures in occupational safety and health during the Renaissance era was Dr. Bernardino Ramazzini. He was an Italian physician who's widely regarded as the father of occupational medicine. Now, I think an argument can be made that Rhazis, who lived 800 years before Dr. Ramazzini, could also have laid claim to that title. But Dr. Ramazzini, occupational health was pretty much all that he did, and he observed so many workers. He did so much documentation that's part of the reason why he's often given credit for being the father of occupational medicine. He actually directly observed workers in their workplaces. He would note unsafe and unhealthy conditions in these workplaces, and then he would draw inferences about causative factors based on his direct observations of workers. Dr. Ramazzini wrote, in the year 1700, wrote a very important work called De Morbis Artificum Diatriba. It was written in Latin. It roughly translates to Diseases of Workers. Dr. Ramazzini recognized there were chemical, physical, and ergonomic hazards in different tasks, and he laid them out in this book. He recommended control measures for these chemical, physical, and ergonomic hazards. Plus, Dr. Ramazzini's writing was also important because it emphasized, once again, the importance of workers to society and the dignity of work. This is something that had not really been much present in the Western world before the Renaissance. Here are a couple of interesting quotes from Dr. Ramazzini, translated from the original Latin. To the questions that are asked of patients by physicians, recommended by Hippocrates, should be asked one more. What is your occupation? This next quote shows that Dr. Ramazzini recognized the importance of ergonomic risk factors in workplaces as well. One source of occupational disease is certain violent and irregular motions and unnatural postures of the body, by reason of which the natural structure of the vital machine is so impaired that serious diseases gradually develop therefrom. Since most of you are public health majors, you've probably had it told to you in many classes that the person we often credit as being the founder of epidemiology as a discipline would be Sir John Snow, who halted a cholera epidemic in Westminster, London, in the mid-1850s using epidemiologic principles before the causative organism Vibrio cholera had even been isolated. I make the argument, though, that One of the most important pioneers of epidemiology was actually Dr. Percival Pott, who lived about a century before Sir John Snow did. What Dr. Pott did was he noticed that there was a high rate of scrotal cancer in English chimney sweeps. These are the men and boys who would have to crawl up into flues and clean out some of the combustion products, the incomplete combustion products. This scrotal cancer, what we now know as squamous cell carcinoma, was very prevalent among people that worked as chimney sweeps. What Dr. Pott correctly identified was that the soot accumulating in the scrotal folds of these chimney sweeps was a likely agent of the cancer. He published his findings and indicated that, certain types of hygiene would help to prevent this, what we now know as squamous cell carcinoma, from ravaging through these workers. He successfully identified the causative factor, even though he didn't know the specific carcinogen. These days, we know that it's benzoate-pyrene, a polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon. He just knew that it was something in the soot that built up in the scrotal folds of these workers. This was the first known and documented link between occupational exposures and cancer. So again, I'm not trying to take anything away from Sir John Snow, but there was important epidemiologic work going on in England 100 years before by Dr. Percival Pott. So now we'll turn our attention to the United States, which was colonized and then founded as a nation during the sort of tail end of the Renaissance era in the Western Europe. Now, before the colonists showed up, the indigenous people who lived in North America, including the United States, did not have what we would consider to be an industrial society. They assigned tasks to different people within their tribes and groups. People would hunt, they would weave, they would grow corn and other forms of agriculture. They would build structures. People sometimes got injured during these tasks, and there would be medicine men who would treat the injuries incurred during these different types of work that were performed. The British colonies of the Americas, particularly of North America, were created to support the crown with agricultural products because there was a different climate in what we now know as the eastern United States compared to the British Isles. And there were some things that grew better in the United States than they did in the British Isles or some of the other territory controlled by the crown at the time. One of the rules that was put into place for some of these chartered colonies was that they were not permitted to have heavy industry to compete with the home region. In other words, if you founded a colony in, say, New York or Charleston or Boston or wherever it was, you couldn't start up a steel mill because you were not permitted to compete with the established steel mills in places like Birmingham, the places that already existed back in England and Scotland and the old world, as we call it. So the very first colonies in the United States did not really have heavy industry. We're talking about for the first 100 or so years, from like this mid-1600s to mid-1700s. They just had very basic industries to sort of help support the colonies, and also a lot of agriculture as well. There was a lot of agricultural infrastructure being built. Now, how was this agricultural infrastructure built? It started off being built by indentured laborers. These were people who agreed to work for a number of years for the colony for agricultural interests in exchange for passage across the Atlantic to the New World. A very sad and tragic and inexcusable choice was also made in the early colonies, which was that a lot of the particularly agricultural infrastructure would be built and worked on by slaves. And in fact, slaves built and maintained most of the commodity crop plantations in what we now know as the southern U.S. There were slaves who worked in the northern colonies as well, too, though, as machine laborers, as craftsmen, as dock and shipyard workers. Again, this was an inexcusable decision that which continues to have public health consequences for the descendants of these enslaved people hundreds of years later. So, starting in about the mid-1700s, some of the colonies that had been established for a while in the United States started to kind of build more substantial manufacturing and industry sector, even though the initial charter they'd signed with the Crown said that they would not do this. But in lieu of having to always import some of these materials from overseas, often with high tariffs, they started to kind of manufacture their own things, again in defiance of the Crown. But this meant that these areas were rapidly industrializing, and there was a big migration happening to cities along the eastern seaboard of the U.S. Some of the people who had come over across the ocean as indentured servants and had served their time and then bought some land out in the country were actually moving back now because some of these jobs paid pretty well. During this era, there was very little regard for workplace safety and health. Certainly, if you were enslaved, you had essentially no rights. You were subjected to deplorable, inhumane conditions and punishments. But even if you were not enslaved, if you were technically considered a free person, it still wasn't a very good time to be a worker in the U.S. because there was a near endless supply of immigrants who could provide cheap, easily replaceable labor, including child labor. There were no laws against child labor at the time. So just very little regard for workplace safety and health. It was believed that poor working conditions were just the cost of doing business, that we had to keep the machinery of industrialization moving forward. Plus, work was considered a voluntary activity. If you were not enslaved, the idea was that you were free to leave and find other options if you could not handle the burdens that came with the job that you took. Of course, the sad truth at the time was that any other job you might have taken in these rapidly industrializing cities would also be dangerous, hot, sweaty, really deplorable working conditions. So it was kind of an illusion of choice. So while it was not the only driver, one of the main drivers of the American Revolution was the tension between the Crown and the U.S. colonies over this industrialization and this competition and the attempts by the Crown to punish U.S. colonies that were producing things in defiance of their charter. Again, it wasn't the only factor in it, but it was a pretty big factor. And after the Revolution, after the United States of America had gained their independence from Great Britain, the industrialization continued on at a very fast pace. Sadly, the regard for workplace safety and health in the United States also continued to be bad throughout from this time all the way through the late 1800s. And here's some images to kind of show you what work was like during this era from roughly the late 1700s to late 1800s. On the upper right, of course, we have a family of slaves who are harvesting cotton, probably incredibly hot and humid conditions. On the upper left, we see the inside of a meatpacking plant. You can see it's crowded in there. It's probably very hot. There's all those exposed belts and pulleys that could probably take an arm off or a hand. So very dangerous working conditions. You would probably also guess correctly that the meat being processed in that plant is also not very sanitary or healthy. In the lower right, you see a wool carding machine being operated by two very young children. Children were often sought out for some of these types of labor because they were small and they could more easily operate some of the machines compared to larger adults. But yeah, what a horrible way to spend your childhood. And again, you see the exposed belt and pulley, and a lot of kids got injured and killed working jobs that were completely not age appropriate. And in the lower right, we see a couple of workers who are pouring some iron ingots. They're not really wearing any personal protective equipment beyond just the suspenders and the pants. But yeah, no eye protection in the event of splatter. There were really poor working conditions that prevailed through the first 100 years after independence. Industrialization and urbanization continued at a very quick pace in the United States all the way through the end of the 1800s without a lot of regard for workplace safety and health. Around the year 1900, though, a subtle change started to occur. Workplace safety and health started to gain a little bit more traction here in the United States. One of the reasons was because of the work of certain muckraker journalists who brought the working conditions of the urban poor to the nation's attention through their writings in newspapers. One of the most famous of the muckrakers was Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book called The Jungle, which documented some of the harsh working conditions in Chicago around a meatpacking plant and some of the working class poverty that the workers dealt with. Now, what most people took from The Jungle was that the conditions were deplorable in terms of product quality, and that the way that meat was processed was really gross. But that was not the intention of the book, and later on, at least anecdotally, it suggested that Upton Sinclair later said sadly that he aimed for people's heart and hit their stomachs with this work. Florence Kelley was another great muckraker journalist of the early 1900s who documented the very grim realities of the work conditions for children and women who worked in sweatshops. Before the year 1900, there were such a thing as unions, but for the most part, organized labor was strictly a thing for people that worked as skilled artisans in particular guilds and crafts and things like that. But then, starting around the year 1900, organized labor began to take up for wage workers, or people who were considered unskilled, meaning they had a job that, that anybody with a little bit of training could theoretically do. The international workers of the world made a big push to sort of organize labor at the wage worker and factory worker level, and they were very successful in doing so. What also happened in the early 1900s was a series of catastrophic mass death workplace events that really began to shake both the public and the workers out of their casual attitudes toward workplace hazards. Here are some examples of high-profile incidents that really drove a lot of public sentiment for improved working conditions. In 1905, in Brockton, Massachusetts, there was a boiler explosion at the Grover Shoe Factory. Killed 58 people. A lot of the boiler and pressure vessel standards that we have to this day stemmed from that disaster. In 1911, in Lower Manhattan, there was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that resulted in 146 fatalities. This led the city of New York to enact several occupational safety inspection protocols, well before there was any state or even national rules for doing so. There were mining and tunneling disasters that occurred in this era too, such as the Monongah mining disaster in 1907, which killed 362 people. And a kind of slow-moving disaster was the Hawk's Nest incident, where a large bunch of workers, most of them African-American migrant workers from the South, came up to work on this hydroelectric project on the New River in Gauley Bridge, West Virginia. And they were digging some hydroelectric diversion tunnels through rock that was basically pure quartz, silica. And it's estimated that more than 700 people died of acute silicosis as a result of their work on these diversion tunnels. The whole thing has been collectively been called the Hawk's Nest incident. One of the founders of industrial hygiene was Dr. Alice Hamilton, who wrote extensively about different working conditions that she saw, one of them being a debilitating jawbone necrosis that was only occurring in a couple places in the U.S. where matches were being made, where workers being exposed to high levels of white phosphorus. The phosphorus was getting into their bone matrix of their jaws and literally rotting their jaws off. Needless to say, this made for very compelling and interesting stories in the news, as did the plight of who were now known as the Radium Girls. These were young girls and women who would paint clock and watch dials in 3 factories located in Connecticut, New Jersey, and Illinois. They would use luminescent radium paint on these dials to make them glow in the dark. They were instructed to lip point their brushes, meaning kind of lick them in between paints in order to fine-tune the brushes. And in doing so, they ingested quantities of radium that would later result in many debilitating conditions. And there was a whole entire book about it called The Radium Girls, which I assign in my PBH 205 class. It's a very fascinating book. I would encourage you to read it if you have not. While there was still not any uniform federal safety and health standards for workplaces in the United States in the mid and early 1900s, the U.S. Department of Labor did start publishing lists of highly hazardous trades and occupational illnesses based upon investigation, based upon data that they collected. And there were some states that built upon these lists by developing industrial health units and actually doing some enforcing of workplace safety and health laws, particularly of these highly hazardous trades within their states. This was kind of an extension of the work that New York City started doing in the 1910s following the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire disaster. Because of their importance in interstate commerce, both mining and railroads did have new regulations established at the federal level in the early 1900s. One of the most important laws for worker rights actually came in the 1900s as well, and that would be workers' compensation laws. Every state in the Union passed them between 1911, when Wisconsin passed them, and 1948, when Mississippi passed them. Before the era of workers' compensation laws, if a person was injured on the job, and they thought that their employer was responsible for their injury, they would have to pursue a tort claim. And then it was a case of an injured, probably not particularly well-off person going against an employer that can probably afford to hire a lot of very good lawyers. So the deck was always stacked against people pursuing torts, and you would have to prove that there was gross negligence. There was a very high burden of proof. What workers' compensation laws did was that they created an insurance system where every employer pays a little bit, and it usually into the system, and then it's kind of like guaranteed no-fault payout, where if a person loses an arm, for example, there would be a fixed amount of compensation owed to that worker. The worker would not have a right to sue, to collect anything beyond workers' compensation unless gross negligence could be proven. So this sort of predictable, no-fault payouts for fixed types of injuries that occur on the job was actually a very important safety and health law, and they came about in the early to mid-1900s. Starting around the turn of the century in 1900, child labor kind of fell out of favor because people started to rightly consider that children don't have the experience and the training, and they need to be getting educated and actually having meaningful growth types of age-appropriate experiences and not being working in dangerous factories. Child labor essentially was ended in 1938 in the U.S. by the Fair Labor Standards Act, another important piece of legislation. So there had been a pretty good trajectory of workplace safety and health actions happening in the early parts of the 1900s, but then World War II broke out, and a lot of focus went on producing as quickly as possible, and so a lot of safety and health kind of took a pause. During the Second World War, there was a rapid industrial upswing because a lot of goods and services were needed for the war effort. This upswing continued after the war, though, after 1945 and the armistice. New products that had been developed for wartime, the research and development, had been done during wartime. There were some uses found, civilian uses for these products, particularly chemicals. There was also another wave of rural to urban migration as more people, including women, began participating in the economy and working in manufacturing and heavy industry to a degree that they had not before. This post-World War II era, there was still no uniform federal laws for workplace safety and health or for environmental protection. As I said before, there had been some states that had started their own industrial health units and started actually inspecting workplaces. What happened, though, when you don't have uniform baseline federal guidance is that some industries get drawn towards areas that don't have strong labor unions, that don't have workplace safety health laws, that don't have strong environmental protection laws. This post-war era is sometimes called the smokestack chasing era. This is where a lot of industries got preferentially drawn to places, particularly in the Deep South, particularly in places that have high populations of minorities, including African Americans. This led to unequal exposures to environmental hazards, to unequal exposures to workplace hazards. There were some regions where it was just inherently more dangerous to work than others. If you were working in a factory in New York versus a factory in Mississippi, there was probably a lot more likely to be hazards that could harm or kill you in the factory in Mississippi, just because there were no strong labor unions, no strong local workplace safety laws. Because a lot of these more noxious industries and dangerous industries were drawn to areas where people couldn't build an adequate NIMBY response, meaning not in my backyard, this led to diminished property values, higher allostatic load, and just some injustices that we continue to see to this day. If you've ever traveled to Louisiana, particularly along the Mississippi River between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, you would see a lot of petrochemical plants, a whole lot of them. And they're there for a reason. It's because this was a region that in the 1940s did not have strong environmental laws or strong workplace safety and health laws. They had a largely African American population that needed jobs and was willing to accept jobs that maybe weren't necessarily good for the environment or good for property values. And this is part of the reason why we still see some of the injustices we do today. There's people that live in these areas. They're exposed to more environmental pollution, more noise pollution, greater allostatic load. And this is just one of the consequences of the way that we industrialized in this country. The late 1950s and the 1960s were a time of many social movements. And one of the social movements that emerged during this time was this recognition that there are some regions of the country where there are basically lax or non-existent workplace safety and health laws. So that's where some of the most dangerous employers are going. And so people who live in those areas, often their only job opportunities are for things that are very dangerous and also very polluting. This era also birthed the civil rights movement and the environmental movement. After Rachel Carson published her book Silent Spring, people started to become more aware of the fact that persistent organic pollutants could have devastating ecological consequences to be beyond just the target species of in this case, DDT, the insecticide that was used to try to kill mosquitoes. There was a massive anti-war movement that came from this era as well as a result of controversies over whether we should be participating in war in Vietnam. And another thing about this era was that more people were having these injustices brought to their attention through this new medium called television. Every home was starting to get a television, and people were seeing news stories about injustices every day during the evening news while they ate their dinner. So along with all the other social movements of this period, there was a big groundswell of support to make some laws at the federal level so that workplace safety and health protections would be mandatory in every state. So it would be no more of this race to the bottom where some states, particularly in the Southeast, would try to make this as lax of laws as possible to be perceived as business friendly. As a result of all this groundswell of support and pressure, finally in the year 1970, the William Steiger Occupational Safety and Health Act was passed. This created two very important agencies, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, who would enforce workplace safety and health standards in workplaces in the United States as part of the Department of Labor, and also the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, which would be the research arm that would investigate and do research on how to make workplaces safer, how to prevent outbreaks of illnesses and injuries from occurring in workplaces. And they were located in the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So now we finally had uniform, baseline federal regulations for workplace safety and health in the United States. Now let's talk about some of the major elements of the OSH Act and of OSHA. The OSH Act lays out as the general duty of every employer to furnish to each of its employees a workplace that is free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. This is known as the General Duty Clause. The General Duty Clause is very important because there are a lot of very specific OSHA standards for particular workplace environments, for construction environments, for particular tasks, but it's not always possible to write a regulation for every single thing that can happen in a workplace. The general duty clause is kind of like the backstop for all this. If there's not a specific standard that says that you can't do a particular thing, if that particular thing is causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm, an employer can be cited for it under the OSHA General Duty Clause, even if there's not a specific regulation in the OSHA standards against it. The OSHA Act also required record keeping to occur so that we could get a better handle on how big of a problem workplace safety and workplace injuries are in the workplace. OSHA and the Bureau of Labor Statistics are required to be notified of workplace injuries or illnesses in high-hazard employers with more than 10 employees by an annual report. Now it's called the OSHA 301 report. It used to be called the 201. There are certain designated categories of employers with more than 20 employees, greater or more than 20 employees, who are not necessarily high-hazard employers, but they're also mandated to report their information electronically on an annual basis to OSHA. The number of fatalities, the number of days of lost work time injuries, these kind of reports are mandated on an annual basis. You're required to contact your local OSHA office in the event of one of the following things happening in your workplace. A fatality. If somebody dies at work, within 8 hours, the nearest OSHA office has to be contacted. This usually will trigger an inspection. It doesn't always, but it usually will. If there's any kind of incident that leads to inpatient hospitalization, meaning that somebody has to be admitted to a hospital because of an injury that occurs on the job, this has to be reported to OSHA within 24 hours. Again, if it's just urgent care or ER treatment and the person's not admitted, they're not required to report this to OSHA. If a person has an amputation or a loss of an eye incident, this has to be reported to the nearest OSHA office within 24 hours of it occurring. We will go over a little bit of the U.S. workplace fatal injury data from the year 2019. I've chosen 2019 because we have a good set of data from that year. It was before COVID. A lot of the COVID-19 pandemic has really skewed a lot of workplace fatal injury data in some kind of unusual ways, but before the pandemic occurred in 2019, we have some data that's fairly representative of what has happened in previous years as well. When I've asked students in the past about what they think is the most dangerous thing on the job, most people assume that it's falls, that most of the fatal injuries that occur at workplaces are due to people falling into manholes, falling off of scaffolds, falling off of roofs. And yes, falls and slips and trips are a major killer in U.S. workplaces, you can see from the second bar. But by far the largest source of fatal workplace injuries in the U.S. are transportation incidents. These are people who are driving as part of their job or operating a vehicle of some sort as part of their job. If we look at those transportation incidents a little bit closer in the year 2019, we'll find that almost 1,300 people died on roadway incidents involving motorized land vehicles. In other words, they were driving a company car or they were driving on company time of some sort, and they were in a fatal roadway collision. But you'll also see that there's a substantial number of pedestrian vehicular incidents. These are people such as construction workers that are working in on road projects, for example, and they get struck by vehicles. You also see a pretty substantial bar for non-roadway incidents involving motorized land vehicles. A lot of motorized vehicles that are dangerous are not necessarily one to think of because they're not licensed to be on the road, but the way they're used, they're often very dangerous and people die using them improperly. These are things such as bulldozers, fork trucks. Just think of any other sort of motorized vehicles that are not licensed for road use, but that are still used on jobs. Almost 250 people died in those types of non-roadway motorized land vehicle incidents in the year 2019. If we want to look at the fatal injury data on workplaces from 2019, there's a couple different ways you can look at it. If you want to know which sector had the highest number of total deaths, it would be the construction industry. There were about 1,200 or so construction workers that died on the job in the year 2019, followed by transportation and warehousing, agricultural, forestry, fishing, and hunting. If you want to look at it by rates, though, what's the most dangerous job based on the number of fatal injuries per 100,000 full-time equivalent workers? In that case, construction is still fairly dangerous, but it's only the fourth most dangerous by rate. Agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting is by far the most dangerous, and you can think about that, it makes a lot of sense. Fishing, commercial fishing in particular, there's a lot of fatalities that occur in that, same with forestry and agriculture, and to some limited degree in hunting as well. Mining, quarrying, and oil and gas extraction is another sector that has a high injury and fatal injury rate, as is transportation and warehousing, followed by construction. So we'll talk about construction injuries in a little bit more depth here, because construction remains a special emphasis program for OSHA because of the high total number of people who die in construction-related workplace incidents, and also it has a fairly high rate as well. There's also a lot of non-fatal injuries that occur on construction sites. OSHA has designated falls, being struck by objects, electrocutions, and being caught in between as the fatal four in construction because these four events are responsible for 57% of all fatalities in the construction industry. This is why being a special emphasis program means any kind of construction site, if an OSHA compliance officer drives by it, they can pull over and open an inspection at any time, even if they don't see any violations of workplace safety and health standards from the roadside. Because falls are responsible for over 1/3 of all fatalities in the construction industry, this is a major emphasis point for OSHA and something that is just every single construction manager knows this by now, that if a person is working over 6 feet above the ground, they have to be protected from falls. That can be by guardrail systems, it can be by other sorts of standard railing, it can be by a fall arrest system such as a lanyard hooked to an anchorage point, but you just cannot subject people to falls of greater than 6 feet on a construction site. If you're wondering about outside of construction industry, in general industry, the standard is 4 feet. You can't be exposed to a fall of greater than 4 feet. This is why for those of you that have worked in warehouses and other places like that, you've probably noticed that on loading docks, which can sometimes be right at 4 feet tall, there will be guardrails along the loading dock to prevent people from falling off of them. What are some of the root causes of most of the fatal occupational injuries that occur outside of the transportation sector? I was an OSHA compliance officer for many years, and I continue to be an occupational safety and health professional, and I can tell you from reviewing the data and just from my own experiences, seeing things with my own eyes, these are the root causes of most of the fatal occupational injuries that you see that are not transportation related. The first one I saw a lot is lack of or inadequate fall protection when working at heights. People working on roofs, for example, and they don't take the time to tie off. And, you can easily lose your balance on a roof, and then next thing you know, you're falling 20 or 30 feet, especially if you're working on a roof of our 2-story houses that we have a lot of here in the Las Vegas Valley, and that is often going to be a fatal fall. Those of you that have worked in restaurant industry or really any kind of manufacturing industry are probably familiar with the concept of lockout, tagout. These are the energy control procedures that are often applied to a piece of equipment before you attempt to perform maintenance on it. And it involves removing all the sources of energy. You lock out the electrical energy, for example, at the breaker box, and then you might have to cycle the piece of equipment a couple times to release residual electrical energy that's in capacitors or mechanical energy, for example. There are a lot of people who tragically die as a result of working on pieces of equipment where every form of energy hasn't been locked out and tagged out before they attempt to work on it. A lot of times people will maintain a piece of equipment and then they will not put the guard back on it, so that dangerous nip points on belts and pulleys, for example, will be left unguarded, and this causes a lot of fatal injuries. Workplaces can be very dynamic as well. Conditions can change from day to day, which is why you can never get complacent. And especially in a construction site or a heavy industrial facility, it's very important to do a pre-work inspection where you go through and make sure that everything is in order, that everything is the way it should be before you start work. Not doing a pre-work inspection and not noticing hazardous conditions that are emerging that later wind up hurting or killing somebody is a root cause for a lot of fatal occupational injuries. Not using required personal protective equipment or using inadequate personal protective equipment also kills a lot of workers. Not storing or improperly using flammable, reactive, or corrosive chemicals is a source of a lot of injuries and also not a small number of deaths, particularly not using proper bonding and grounding when dispensing flammable liquids, which can then sometimes result in static sparks and ignition and explosions. A lot of times people will have to work on utilities that are buried in the ground, and they'll have to excavate them out to access the pipe or the wires or whatever it is. If those trenchings and excavations are not done properly, they can cave in on workers, causing usually a fatal crush injury because 1 cubic yard of dirt can weigh 1,800 pounds. So doing a trenching and excavation and not doing proper shoring or benching and leading to cave-in, it happens way too often. And probably the main root cause I've seen time and time again when I've had to investigate fatal occupational injuries is that the person who often winds up fatally injured is someone who's inexperienced. They're performing a task or attempting to perform a task for which they have not received adequate training. And sometimes it's because maybe they wanted to show that they were on top of it or that they're self-motivated or whatever the case may be. But when people attempt to perform tasks that they've not been adequately trained for, it often leads to tragedy. When we talk about non-fatal occupational injuries, this will not be a surprise to you, I'm sure. We've already talked about the injury pyramid earlier in the semester. Non-fatal occupational injuries are often underreported. And if there's no follow-up investigation, any kind of after-action report, for example, then the risk factors that led to the non-fatal injury might remain in the workplace. And the next person that encounters those risk factors, they might get more seriously injured or possibly even killed. Again, always remember that if there is a condition that caused somebody to receive a fatal injury, there are probably that condition has probably also caused several people before that to receive lesser injuries. And if we had acted upon those lesser injuries when those occurred, the fatality would not have occurred. This is the injury pyramid concept that you're all familiar with by now. Based on the data that we do have, there are estimates that have been made by the National Safety Council for how many non-fatal injuries occur in the workplace in a given year, in this case the year being 2019. The estimate is that every 7 seconds a worker is injured on the job, about 4.6 million workers a year. The types of injuries that keep workers away from work, a lot of times it's sprains, strains, or tears, soreness or pain, cuts, lacerations, or punctures. If we're wondering what kind of workplace injury events result in the most lost work days, which as we'll talk about shortly, being injured so that you have to miss work often leads to a lot of other negative public health outcomes. The main cause of lost work days is overexertion, where somebody lifts or lowers something without really adequately gauging its weight first, or when somebody just engages in repetitive motions so that eventually they get an ergonomic injury. Contact with objects and equipment is the second workplace injury event most likely to result in lost work days. And slips, trips, and falls is number 3, where people fall to a lower level or they fall to the same level. That's almost a quarter of all injuries that result in lost work days. We want to control hazards in the workplace that could possibly lead to serious injury or even death. There are different methods you can use to control occupational hazards. There's a hierarchy of these controls. There are some that are more effective and would work better than others. Now, by saying there's a hierarchy, that doesn't mean that all methods are not important. They are. It's just that there are some methods that physically get rid of the hazard in the workplace or substitute out something that's less hazardous or somehow keep the worker away from the hazard. So if we look at the very top of the hierarchy of controls, this is elimination. This physically removes the hazard from the workplace, whatever that hazard is. And elimination, obviously, is expensive. It sometimes requires completely rethinking what it is you're doing and how you're doing it, or maybe even the nature of work, as we'll get into in a minute. But that's at the very top. If we can physically remove the hazard from the workplace, then nobody can be injured by it or possibly killed. The next level in the hierarchy of controls is substitution. For substitution, we're talking about removing something that's hazardous in the workplace and replacing it with something else that can do the same job, but that is known or believed to be less hazardous. An example of this would be methylene chloride or dichloromethane has been used as industrial solvent and degreaser for many years, but it has a lot of carcinogenic potential. So now a lot of workplaces have removed methylene chloride and started using 1-bromopropane in its place. Now we don't know all the full health hazards of 1-bromopropane, it's just that preliminary toxicology studies seem to indicate that it was less toxic than methylene chloride, so you replace the hazard in this case. The next level is engineering controls. This is where the hazard still exists, but you're doing things such as enclosures and isolations and things like that isolate people from the hazard so that if the workplace engineering controls are in place and being used properly, the worker should not get injured. They do require a physical change to the workplace, so they're not quite as preferred as substitution or elimination. Next on the hierarchy of controls is administrative controls. This is how you change the way people work so that they are less likely to encounter a hazard or create a hazard. An administrative control would be, for example, storing flammable liquids and oxidizers in separate ends of a building so that they don't have a chance to mix in the event of an earthquake or some other major event. At the very bottom of the hierarchy of controls is personal protective equipment, or PPE. And PPE is very important too. It's just that if you're making people wear PPE to protect them from a hazard, that you're kind of acknowledging that some of the other controls either weren't used or didn't work. And the hazard is actually right there at the worker, and the worker has to put something on and put it on correctly in order to be protected. That's why PPE is considered the last line of defense, it's considered the least effective, and that's why it's at the bottom of the hierarchy of controls. That doesn't mean that it's not important. Undergirding all of the hierarchy of controls is training. You certainly want workers to be well trained in how to wear their personal protective equipment, how to do their job in a safe way, how to make sure that engineering controls are in place and operating. And then you want both workers and maybe management and people that think about these things to consider whether substitution and elimination might be a viable option for some workplace hazards that might not actually have to exist if we're creative. So that's why training is important in all phases of the hierarchy of controls. Now I'll give you a little bit more tangible example of the hierarchy of controls. In this case, the hazard we're wanting to eliminate is preventing the injuries that occur when people are using riding mowers and they have a rollover, as happens sometimes on uneven terrain. This is somewhat like the Haddon matrix exercise in that if you try to think of a category in each of the 5 hierarchy of controls for something, you might not always come up with something. There might be some blanks, and that's okay. But let's start at the very top with elimination. If you have a workplace that has grass that somebody is mowing, you could consider elimination. You move to xeriscaping or do some kind of other thing to replace the turf lawn that has to be mowed. I mean, that's the most extreme example, but that's something you can certainly consider if you wanted to eliminate the hazard of riding mower rollovers. For substitution, again, this will also be somewhat of an elimination thing, but maybe consider autonomous or semi-autonomous mowers that maybe are remote controlled operated or that a person might have to physically sit on, but they don't have to actually make any of the decisions. They're just kind of there to sort of like a person behind the wheel of an autonomous vehicle. And these mowers would shut down if they sensed that you were maybe above about a 15-degree banking or something where rollover could happen. Again, this technology might not even exist, but it's more of a creative exercise here to think about would it be a substitutable hazard for removing this injury hazard. The next is engineering controls. These are things like automatic shutoffs on a mower whenever it senses instability or sliding. Probably the best example of engineering controls on a riding lawnmower are pictured here in a couple of the pictures of rollover protective structures, which you have to wear with seat belts, or else the rollover protective structure can actually crush the person if they roll the mower over. So ROPS have to be worn with seat belts. You do them together. That would be an effective engineering control where if a person was in a mower rollover incident, they're probably not going to be too seriously injured. Administrative controls. I almost think that you can consider ROPS and seat belts to be an administrative control as well, because the whole thing doesn't work if the employee isn't trained to do the right thing, which is make sure the ROPS bar is up, make sure your seat belt is fastened. If neither one of those things are happening, the engineering control doesn't work. So therefore, those are also administrative controls. It also can have an administrative control, like have one of those little altimeters on the mowers, and if you have to mow on an incline that's more than 15 degrees, you just don't do it. Those can get zero-scaped or something, but you can have a policy of no mowing any inclines. Personal protective equipment, this one's a little more difficult. I mean, certainly people wear PPE when they ride lawnmowers. They often will wear hearing protection. They'll might wear a N95 or a face mask to keep the grass clippings and dust out of your respiratory tract. But if you're thinking about PPE that can actually protect you in the event of a lawnmower rollover, you'd be talking about some pretty heavy, like Kevlar or some of the type of armor, and that's just not something that's really realistic for a person to be wearing, especially while mowing. So again, if you try to do this exercise think about any type of workplace injury, you might not be able to come up with a feasible answer for each of the 5 categories of hierarchy of control. So once again, when you're thinking about hazards in the workplace that might cause occupational injuries or possibly even death, I want you to always keep those hierarchy of controls in mind. Think about what could be done to mitigate that hazard. What's feasible? What's economically feasible? What's technologically feasible? What maybe hasn't been invented yet but needs to be invented? It's okay to just completely ask yourself those questions. Be creative. That's how a lot of things get solved, and that's how a lot of people get protected. So in terms of some of the physical hazards in the workplace, we already talked about transportation hazards being the number 1 category of workplace fatalities. Slips, trips, and falls are the number 1 hazard on construction sites. The fatal 4 we talked about before are not just a menace in the construction industry. They also are surprisingly common in general industry, especially falls and electrocutions, particularly when somebody that's maybe not fully been trained on how to maintain a piece of equipment is asked to do so. And like we talked about before, they want to please their boss, so they work on a piece of equipment even if they don't quite know what they're doing. And that's how electrocutions can happen. Same with falls, honestly. Fires and explosions can happen in the workplace as well, especially when you're working with flammable chemicals, oxidizing substances, reactive substances, and also combustible dust. If you have an environment where a lot of very fine dust is being generated, and you don't have really well-sealed electrical components, you can have explosions. This happens not infrequently. And when dust explosions happen, they can cause really big explosions that hurt and kill a lot of people. Noise is another hazard in workplaces that can cause both acute injuries and also more long-term noise-induced hearing loss, which is often considered more of a disease. For noise, OSHA has established a permissible exposure limit of 90 A-weighted decibels as an 8-hour time-weighted average. Nobody's supposed to be exposed to hazards beyond that without some engineering controls, personal protective equipment, administrative controls, or elimination substitutions in order to bring this down below 90 A-weighted decibels is 8-hour time-weighted average. Those of you that have worked or will work in healthcare settings, probably one of the most common recordable injuries in healthcare settings is needle sticks, where somebody's injecting a patient or taking some blood and inadvertently stick themselves with a needle. Every time it happens, it's a potentially serious injury depending on the serology of the patient whose blood would be on the syringe. So always take needle sticks seriously. There are actually some engineering and administrative controls that make needle sticks a little bit less likely. Things like self-sheathing and self-retracting needles, safer needle devices. Musculoskeletal disorders, particularly from what we might call ergonomic injuries, are also very common in workplaces. This really became a serious problem. I talked in a previous lecture about how Henry Ford invented the assembly line, or was one of the first people to perfect the assembly line as a method of quickly producing, in his case, Model T vehicles. But human beings were not necessarily designed to do the same repetitive task over and over again for multiple hours per day. So that's how musculoskeletal disorders started to become even more of a hazard in the workplace. You can also get an MSD from overexertion when you load your muscles too much, when you do dynamic loading. This would be the case in healthcare settings where you're helping to lift or do patient handling, and patients can be kind of a dynamic source of weight sometimes. They can shift around a little bit while you're trying to pick them up, and that can cause a lot of musculoskeletal injuries to both the patient and to the person trying to lift the patient. Vibration disorders can lead to pain and circulatory problems. For people that operate things such as jackhammers, there's a condition called Raynaud's phenomenon or white finger syndrome, where the vibration will sort of affect the peripheral circulation and the very fine blood vessels at the tips of fingers, and that can cause this numbness and white finger syndrome. Certainly any kind of prolonged static postures or repetitive motions. Again, the human body was designed to be a little bit more dynamic, and when you hold it in one posture for too long or make it do something repetitious for too long, it tends to not like that. And there's various office ergonomic problems for people that have what you might consider white-collar jobs. For people that rest their elbows on hard surfaces for long periods of time, people who type too much with their thumbs, particularly if they're trying to send a text, for example. One that I see a lot in my own job is poor monitor positioning, where somebody's using a workstation and they've got a monitor, and the monitor is too low so that they're kind of hanging their head, and that will, when you hang your head low, it creates a lot of pressure at the base of your neck, and that can get very painful very quickly. A lot of times, this is one of the more common lost time injuries, actually, in the modern workplace. If you've ever thought about chemical hazards in the workplace, you probably would consider that the profile of a chemical hazard in the workplace is something that you're exposed to for very small amounts over time, sort of a chronic exposure pattern, and that whenever the bad thing happens, it tends to be like a disease, where you get something like cancer after many years of repeated low levels exposures to something. And that does happen with certain chemicals like styrene, benzene, methylene chloride. But there are some chemical hazards that can actually create sort of acute injuries. One of the most obvious examples would be corrosive chemicals. If you ever work with a chemical that has a pH of less than or equal to 2, or greater than or equal to 12.5, it can cause injurious exposures upon immediate contact. It can immediately start to burn and defat the skin and cause a pretty serious injury. There are some chemicals such as isocyanates and formaldehyde where relatively short-term acute exposures can actually sensitize you or can trigger intense allergies. And in that case, it does really fit more the profile of an injury more than an illness. And there are some chemicals such as organic lead and other heavy metal compounds and pesticides such as paraquat that are so acutely toxic that, you get exposed to a high level at work just one time and you're ill very soon afterwards. So some chemical hazards in the workplace actually do cause sort of a more acute injury type pattern, and some other ones cause more of a chronic disease type pattern. Similarly, with inhalation hazards in the workplace, there's a little bit of a disagreement in the occupational safety and health community about whether what they're causing is an illness or an injury. And a lot of it has to do with the latency period and things like that, but there's some mineral and organic dust that you can get a high enough acute exposure to die very quickly or become seriously ill very quickly after just a little bit of exposure. We talked before about, for example, silica, how the men who drilled and they were all men, who drilled the diversion tunnels in the New River Gorge in Golly Bridge, West Virginia back in the 1930s. They suffered an acute silicosis that very quickly made them seriously ill, and many of them died. And if you think about it, asbestos, silica, coal dust, cotton dust, talcum, you breathe those things in and they don't really go away. They get down into the gas exchange deep regions of the lung, and they don't really go away. So your body fights a futile attempt to sort of get rid of them, and you get oxidative damage. So then later on, when you get bisonosis or silicosis or mesothelioma or lung cancer, whatever the condition might be, there are people that still disagree about whether that was caused by an injury from the one exposure or if it's more like an illness. And it's the same with metal dust. Beryllium, lead, cadmium, they can cause chronic illnesses with sort of low-level, long-term exposures, and they can cause acute illnesses with short-term, high exposures. I said before that I wanted to cover this topic a little bit differently, that rather than talk a lot about the direct costs of occupational injuries, I would maybe mix it up a little bit, instead kind of just go deeply into the history of it, but at this point I'm going to talk about one of the important hidden costs of occupational injuries. And this is from the Applebaum and colleagues article that you were assigned to read during this module. We just need to acknowledge the fact that this is not unique to occupational injuries, but it's probably more likely to happen with occupational injuries, because when people get injured on the job, and especially if they can't go back to their job, that can cause a loss of identity. It can cause a lot of escalating negative effects. One of the biggest ones being opioid addiction. People can be prescribed opioids, painkillers, because they got a workplace injury, and then later on they become addicted to them. They don't want to taper off because the addiction is so powerful and the withdrawal symptoms are so powerful, so that then they either engage in drug-seeking behavior to try to get more prescription, or they go down the path toward illicit drugs, such as heroin. That's going to be covered in a film you're going to watch later in the semester. Anytime that a person is injured on the job and they have to miss some time from work, there's an increase in what's called allostatic load. This is sort of the chronic levels of stress that cause us to generate more cortisol, and just kind of, it's like a series of sort of little microaggressions and little problems that just kind of drag us down and make us less healthy. And the allostatic load can increase because you lose income. You might become food and housing insecure as a result of a workplace injury. Certainly the pain and suffering can increase your allostatic load. And as I mentioned before, the loss of identity. People that suffer on-the-job injuries, and the Applebaum article confirms this, are at increased risk of depression and an increased risk of suicide. So what Applebaum and colleagues found in looking at data from New Mexico workers was that for those who were identified as female, there was a hazard ratio of 2.93 for overdose for those who had to miss some time off work due to a workplace injury. So that hazard ratio means they were 2.93 times more likely to have an overdose than those who had not suffered a work-related injury that caused them to miss time. As you can see from the 95% confidence interval, that's well over 1. So that's a highly statistically significant hazard ratio. For suicide, they found that the risk in females was 1.92, the hazard ratio, meaning 1.92 times more likely than people who had not suffered a workplace injury that caused them to miss days from work. And there, once again, it was statistically significant at the 95% confidence level. When they looked at those who were identified as male, the numbers were a little bit lower. The hazard ratio was 1.29 for overdose. And as you can see, it wasn't quite significant at the 95% confidence level. The lower level was 0.95, the lower level estimate at 95% confidence. But I would still argue that that's clinically significant, even if it's not statistically significant. For suicide, the hazard ratio was 1.72, and that was statistically significant. So all of these downstream negative effects are much more likely for people who suffer a work-related injury that takes them away from work and causes them to lose their identity, possibly become food and housing insecure. It all adds up. This is why it's so important to reduce or eliminate occupational injuries if we can. As we get near the end of this lecture, I want to talk about sort of some of the good things here in the United States in terms of occupational injuries in the present day. There has been a lot of progress made over the course of our history, as we went over earlier. There's still quite a ways to go, but let's acknowledge some of the things that are good. One thing that is good is that workers' compensation, that sort of no-fault system of predictable payments after a compensable injury occurs, is in place for almost all workers, as is wage protection, so that if a person has to take some time off from work, their wages are actually protected, as well as their job while they're away. That's one of the OSHA standards. Rehabilitation is available to most workers as a result of occupational safety and health laws. We have OSHA standards and enforcement all across the United States. So there's a baseline level of protection for almost all employees. And the reason I say almost will become clear a little bit later on. There's also a confidential means for employees to report unsafe working conditions. An employee can always call 1-800-321-OSHA or their nearest OSHA office and report any condition that concerns them in the workplace. Sometimes that will trigger an inspection, sometimes it will trigger a letter investigation, but either way, that's available to all employees. There's widespread knowledge of effective engineering controls, work practices, and personal protective equipment that can reduce risk. I don't think we think enough about elimination and substitution, personally, in the United States, or really worldwide. And I want you all to, if you go forward as a public health professional, to always keep this in mind. Always question the fact of, do we really need to expose people to this hazard? There are some manufacturing processes, for example, where elimination or substitution has always been determined to be infeasible. That if we want this product or this service, people are going to have to risk their life and health to provide it. I think it's completely legitimate for us to question that at all times, to just ask ourselves, is it really critical to humanity that this happens? So we get a good handle on engineering controls, work practices, and PPE. I would like to encourage you all to always think more about elimination and substitution for all types of occupational injury hazards, wherever you might work, wherever you might go. Another good thing that I've seen repeatedly is that there are a lot of employers who really want to do the right thing. They're being very thoughtful. They sought ways to empower employees to help make their workplaces safer, rather than just sort of a command and control, do what we say, and if you get injured, it's probably because you messed up and therefore it's your fault. They've really sought to empower employees, and one of the most important ways you can empower employees is to give them stop work authority. This means that frontline employees, if they witness an unsafe condition, or if they feel like they do not have the training or personal protective equipment to safely perform a task, they actually have the authority to say, no, I won't do this, or to sort of stop the assembly line or stop the process until their concerns are addressed. The picture you see here of the long red cord that's attached to the big red button, That's an example of a stop work system where if somebody sees something that concerns them, they can pull that cord and stop the line. Really thoughtful employers provide this sort of authority to even their frontline employees, people who are most directly affected by the potential hazards. And of course, there has to be some give and take. There has to be an understanding that the frontline employees will not abuse the system or just use it to unnecessarily disrupt production. But it's something that a lot of thoughtful employees have started to do. Another thing that I've seen a lot of thoughtful employees do is that actually encourage reporting of near-miss incidents and minor injuries, because as we talked about before with the injury pyramid, sometimes if something bad doesn't happen but comes close to happening, or if a very minor little thing happens, that maybe somebody cuts a finger, those are both indications that there is a burgeoning hazard in the workplace that needs to be addressed. And if it's allowed to go on, it might hurt somebody far worse the next time. So actually encouraging reporting of the near-miss incidents, the things that don't really go on the OSHA 300 log, but that are still worth knowing about and worth documenting and trying to fix. And really good employers are starting to do root cause analyses and corrections. Anytime there's an incident, a near miss, or anytime employees express a concern that warrants action. Root cause analysis is really important for occupational injuries, and it's not done often enough. But when people do it, you actually get hazards out of the workplace, you get empowered workers, you get just a much better and safer workplace. When you don't do root cause analysis, what happens is that people write in the after action report that the employee learned their lesson and will be more careful next time. And that's not helpful at all. That's not the kind of analysis and corrective activities that you want to have. But thankfully, a lot more employers are starting to get this now. So there's also a flip side, alas. There are some things that really do concern me a lot right now here in the United States about the sort of the work environment that we've built here and some of the things that I don't think are particularly positive. One is that a lot of workers essentially have no benefits. They have no health insurance, so they're not doing a lot of preventive screenings for things that maybe their workplace is exacerbating. There are some employees who are not even covered under workers' compensation or even have coverage under OSHA. There's a lot of people who are self-employed. There's people who are gig economy workers. There's people who are undocumented. And a lot of times they slip through the cracks. OSHA coverage and workers' compensation does not always reach them. There's also a few key employers, and I hesitate to name names, but it's something I've seen many times where in some of these key companies, which you see them listed here on the slide, there's a workplace culture that's very troubling, where the bosses kind of demand excessive loyalty, working a lot of time off the clock, that you're supposed to be dedicated to the project more than the paycheck, where people are sort of told not to complain ever because you're working for one of the best companies and there are lots of other people who'd rather be here to replace you. And they're just very profoundly anti-union and profoundly organized labor. And it's just something that I see workers losing their power at some of these key companies. And I find this to be a troublesome culture that I hope does not take wider root here in the U.S. I told you a little while ago about some good companies that were starting to ask their employees and train their employees and empower their employees to report everything that concerns them. Near-miss incidents, minor injuries, just things that they think are not as safe as they could be. Well, another thing that's happened a lot in workplaces, which I think does the exact opposite, is a safety incentive program where a company will offer a prize, for example, to employees if they can go so many hours without a lost time incident. What happens a lot of times when you have a safety incentive program is that people hide things. They might get a minor injury, or they might have a near miss, and they won't say anything because they want to keep the streak going, because if you get to 10 more days, everybody gets a steak dinner, or whatever the prize is for a lot of these safety incentive programs. But what I've seen a lot of times from a lot of employee interviews is that safety incentive programs will often encourage the hiding and underreporting of minor injuries and conditions. And as we know, minor injuries and conditions, if left unaddressed, can later result in major injuries. So I would actually like to see all of these sort of safety incentive programs kind of go away. There are better ways to do it. I mentioned before that there's a baseline level of occupational safety and health protection available in the U.S. It's not uniform, though. There's regional differences in working conditions. There's some states that run their own OSHA offices. They don't rely on federal OSHA. And some of them are better funded than others. I mean, all of them have to enforce the occupational safety and health standards, but some of them are understaffed. They don't visit the workplaces as often as they really should in order to ensure that workplaces are kept up to a baseline level. And it's just a fact. If you live in California or New York, you're probably have a safer workplace than if you live in Mississippi or Alabama. There's just long-standing social and environmental justice issues at play, too, where a lot of the most dangerous employers, the big petrochemical plants, for example, many years ago, when there was no uniform environmental laws, they were being cited in places like the Deep South, where there was less of a NIMBY response, there was more of a need for jobs, and so this continues to this day. There are some places where it's just safer to work than others because of these long-standing social and environmental justice issues. Having uniform baseline standards hasn't really fully changed that. One of the saddest facts is that so much is known now about how to prevent workplace injuries and deaths, but yet mass casualty fatal workplace incidents still occur in the U.S. at relatively frequent intervals. I'm just going to give you a few examples. There are many more examples you can find if you dug around, though. One that some of my former colleagues in North Carolina investigated in the early 1990s was the Imperial Foods fire. 25 people died in this fire and 54 people were injured. It kind of harkened back to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire back in 1911 in New York City, and that the reason why so many people died when this fire broke out in this facility was that the emergency exit doors at this Imperial Foods plant had been chained shut to prevent employees from stealing chickens. This was a chicken processing plant. And so there was some criminal negligence found of the plant operator and owner, which is understandable and also justified. There was some prison time that occurred as a result of this. But it was kind of shocking to think that 80 years after the lessons should have been learned from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, that people were still burning to death in workplaces where the emergency exits had been chained shut. A similar name company, but different, the Imperial Sugar Company in Georgia back in 2008 had a massive explosion. I talked before about how combustible dust, if you are not careful with the electrical and other environments, can rapidly ignite and explode. And that's what happened here, and it caused 13 people to die. 29 miners died back in 2010 in the upper Big Branch mining disaster. Every few years, unfortunately, there's another underground mining disaster. It's still happening in the present day. And one was not so long ago, so that you probably remember it because of the environmental impact, and that would be the Deepwater Horizon explosion in the Gulf of Mexico back in 2010. This drilling rig platform in the Gulf of Mexico exploded. 11 people lost their lives, more or less immediately after the explosion. And then after that, the oil well continued to leak oil into the Gulf of Mexico for weeks afterward. It was the largest oil spill in U.S. history, and it devastated the shrimp and clam and mussel crops and really hurt commercial fishing for many years, besides the direct fatalities that occurred. So, sad to say, these events keep happening despite everything that we know. So here at the very end, I'm going to talk about some of the future challenges as I see them in the realm of occupational injuries. First of all, climate change and climate disruption is real. It's happening. It's largely driven by anthropogenic sources of carbon. There's near unanimous scientific consensus about this. So instead of arguing about it anymore, we should be trying to prepare for the future while we also try to decarbonize where we can. And one of the ways we need to prepare for the future is that to acknowledge that outdoor work especially is going to get harder. There's going to be greater likelihood of heat stress and heat-related illnesses. And so we need to be preparing workers for that. We need to be thinking about elimination and substitution, and just also training and other ways to sort of mitigate the risk of working outdoors in an increasingly hot planet. People are at greater injury risk whenever they don't have a predictable shift where they can sort of get proper rest, get proper circadian rhythms. A lot of people that do shift work where they're working nights one week and then days the next, or where they're doing gig work where they get a contract to do something and they have to finish it as quickly as possible, or just anytime people are working longer hours at a time in order to finish a project or what have you. Those increase employee physical and mental fatigue, and those increase the employee risk of injury. We work best when we have predictable schedules and time off to rest, and that's just, in the new economy, that's becoming less and less common with the way people work. For many years now, in the interest of efficiency, a lot of manufacturers have adopted just-in-time processes. This means that rather than ordering huge bulk supplies of all the things you need in your supply chain to create the product, you just order it right when you need it. This way you don't have to warehouse a bunch of raw materials and things like that. Well, COVID-19 has shown us that one tiny disruption to your supply chain can grind the whole manufacturing process to a halt. And then, whether it's cars or semiconductor chips or potato chips or whatever it is, we're kind of entering an era now where there's a lot more boom and bust cycles. This means that sometimes a plant has to shut down for a week or two because the critical thing that they need is just not available. And then once that thing becomes available again, people have to ramp up and work faster and harder in order to sort of make up for that lost time when they were shut down. And again, all this was, in my opinion, unnecessary because so many employers adopted this just-in-time manufacturing process and mindset. But it does create boom and bust cycles of occupational risk factors where people are either not working at all or they're working really, really fast to make up for the time when they were not working. And employment itself has changed because of this. Employee protections are a frequent political target. If I've heard it one time, I've heard it 1,000 times. Anytime that an OSHA standard is proposed, you hear this idea that OSHA standards kill jobs, that this is another job-killing government overreach. And so it's just, OSHA is always under threat of being defunded. Standards are often in danger of being declared unconstitutional if it's deemed that this piece of administrative law exceeded the legislative intent for what that administrative agency should have been able to do. They're a frequent political target, and that's only going to continue and get worse in the future. Another future challenge is that new things are being manufactured all the time, especially chemical products. New products being manufactured and released every year before we know the full risk to workers, or for that matter, even the public. One example from the last couple decades is there's a chemical called diacetyl. It's the chemical that makes that butter flavoring in microwave popcorn. What's been found is that what we thought was a harmless chemical is actually not harmless at all. And the workers in these popcorn plants that got exposed to relatively high levels of this diacetyl were developing a condition called popcorn lung, or bronchiolitis obliterans. And it's a pretty serious lung disease. Now, none of the end consumers of the microwave popcorn product are exposed enough to it for it to be a hazard to them, but it's a hazard to the workers. If you've heard about diacetyl as well, for other reasons, it might be because it's been found in some vaping fluids as well. So yeah, that's just an example of something that we don't know the long-term effects yet because it's not been around long enough. And it's the same with other workplace and even recreational exposures that we have not yet fully characterized because we're still kind of part of a natural experiment right now. One of those is blue light. I hope those of you that have portable handheld devices that you tend to use them in the blue light reduction mode because absorbing a lot of blue light, particularly in the hour or two before you go to bed, is very disrupting to circadian rhythms, to melatonin production, and has been shown to, we don't know what the long-term effect's going to be because, again, people haven't been using these devices within less than a foot from their eyeballs for very long. The same with low-level EMF emissions. We don't know exactly what might be the long-term effects 30 or 40 years down the road from carrying a cell phone in your pocket, because people haven't been doing that for 30 or 40 years. Well, I would imagine there's probably not going to be any hazard because electromagnetic fields are incredibly low energy. We don't yet know, do we? And so that's the end of this lecture. You also have a Falls lecture to listen to for this week. Thank you for your time today. Let me know if you have any questions.